Okay, well, look, thank you everyone for coming to another session of Philosophy Matters, and I especially welcome all the new people who have recently joined. For those who don't know me, I'm Allan. I'm the facilitator of this group. I'm going to hand over to Usha to moderate tonight's talk. Thank you very much, Usha.
Welcome everyone. Really happy to see we're about 36 of here, and I'm really looking forward to the individual sessions, to the discussion between Les and Akiva, and the Q&A that will follow. So I'm really going to be reading out a little bit about Les. So over a decade, Les Allan studied philosophy and history of religions at La Trobe University. In his working life, his career has spanned electronics, information technology, training and development, and business development. And over the last few years, he has authored many articles and given various talks on humanism, ethics, religion, and philosophy. He currently serves on the committee of Humanist Victoria and is the owner and manager of rationalrealm.com, to which we owe lots of amazing philosophy-related resources. And it's a website dedicated to exploring the boundaries between science and philosophy, as he calls it. So over to you, Les.
Thank you, Usha, for a wonderful introduction. Now, let me just start up my slideshow. So thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Look, I've been really looking forward to this. This dialogue was suggested by Akiva on human rights, and both of us have got a really keen interest in ethics, so I leapt at the chance. So once again, if you want to download the two PowerPoint packs, mine and Akiva's, the URL is up there at the top. When you go to the Rational Realm website, you'll need to actually type in /downloads/ to go to the downloads page, or you can use those two direct URLs that I pasted in before. I'm going to do some preliminaries tonight. I'm just planning on speaking for about 20-25 minutes, and then the core of it's going to be addressing three objectives I want to achieve tonight. And the first is that I think human rights is what we think of as human rights. Each human right points to a fundamental condition of a human society to allow the members of that society to achieve maximal happiness and to minimize suffering. So the human rights really point to these fundamental conditions. The second thing I want to talk about tonight is that consequentialism gives us a way of rationally adjudicating for when human rights conflict, or when a human right conflicts with another obligation or a basic human need. So consequentialism gives us a way of doing that in a rational way. The third thing I want to do tonight is to address some of the objections to a consequentialist view of looking at human rights. Now, there are, in the literature, human rights writers generally agree on some pretty fundamental things about what a human right is. I'm not going to go through these. You can look at these on the slide set, but it includes things like human rights are high priority, that they're inalienable, that they're not absolute, and that they're universal. Now, I've got a lot of information in these slides. This 20 minutes, I'm doing a very quick summary overview of my thinking on moral rights. One thing I think a moral rights theory, two things I think a moral rights theory must do if it's going to be a credible rights theory. And one is it needs to be able to ground human rights. And what I mean by that, it needs to be able to pick out which things are rights, and it also needs to pick out which things or beings have rights. Is it only adult human beings? Does it include children? Does it include animals? Some people think it includes things in the environment like trees and mountains. So it needs to be able to give us a good reasoned explanation of what things have rights. The second thing a good moral rights theory must be able to do is it must be able to tell us how to adjudicate rationally between competing rights. Now, I think a consequentialist approach to ethics satisfies both of these fundamental requirements for rights theory. Now, you might say, why have a Bill of Rights at all, or why have human rights, why recognise human rights? I think from a consequentialist point of view, there's two reasons. One is an inward-facing reason, that a system of human rights provides checks and balances for a nation state when they're framing new legislation or when they're reviewing current legislation or old legislation. The second thing about having a Bill of Rights is that it's outward facing. It allows the international community or some nations to apply moral and legal pressure on other despotic or nation states that are not attuned to the welfare of their citizens. So what is consequentialism? If you're not familiar with the term in moral philosophy, I think this is it in a nutshell. Consequentialism is a moral theory that judges the rightness and wrongness of actions, rules, or social practices on the extent to which they produce good. And here, good is typically happiness or satisfaction or well-being or human welfare or human flourishing. It also judges the rightness and wrongness of actions to the extent that it prevents bad. And here, bad could mean typically pain, suffering, or dissatisfaction. Now, consequentialism is a broad set of theories that look at consequences of rules, social practices, and actions. But there's a limited kind of consequentialism, or one type of consequentialism that looks at particular goods, and these are the goods that I've mentioned here: human happiness and human suffering. More broadly speaking, consequentialism, a consequentialist could regard other kinds of goods as having intrinsic value. So it could be beauty, knowledge, friendship, currently sometimes put up as other kinds of goods. So utilitarianism is just one kind of moral theory within the broader set of consequentialist theories. Now, all of those are contrasted with deontological theories, and they're a set of theories that judge the rightness and wrongness of an action to the extent that it is in accordance with or transgresses a moral rule, somewhat independently of the act's good or bad consequences. Now, I say here somewhat independently because a good deontological theory will have some account of duties to make people happy and not make them suffer, but it will say that's not the only consideration. The consideration is about whether an act is in concert with a rule, and that rule is not always about and only about creating good, like human happiness. Now, I've got an example, a concrete example to illustrate the difference. I'll just skip that over. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is looking at the historical context of human rights, how they developed through human history, because when you look at particular instances of the development of human rights instruments, you get to see the reasoning behind it and the social and what's going on. So I'm just going to have a look at a couple. The first one, the Bill of Rights. This is the first Bill of Rights in the world in 1689. And this came about as a reaction against King James II of England, excessive punishments, abuse of courts and parliamentary representation. So here people were suffering and they were pushing back against that, against the monarchy. The other one is the French Revolution, which led to the Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789. And here, this was a reaction to King Louis XVI with rising social and economic inequality, ballooning government debt, economic depression, unemployment, high food prices, and a regressive tax system. Now, I've got other cases there which you can look at, but I want to get to the key learning out of all of these instantiations and developments in human rights documents. The key lessons here that human rights did not appear from on high or in a vacuum. They all evolved over centuries in political contexts in which people were suffering and wanted to put systems in place to make sure that suffering didn't happen in the future. And human rights did extend over time to include serfs, commoners, women, slaves, children, subjugated minorities. So that's an important thing about the historical context. Human rights aren't set in stone. There's been continual development of them since the Magna Carta in the 1200s. Now, on the Facebook page and the meetup page, I put an example of a human rights document, probably the most important one because it's the international legal document for imposing human rights on nation states. So you can have a look at that at your leisure. We're going to be coming back to this when we talk about human needs. So my key claim so far is that these human rights that have been identified are foundational principles on which to build societies where individuals may attain maximal happiness and prevent suffering. So I think a fundamental axiom I think we can all agree to is that a person leads a happy, contented and satisfying life when their fundamental human needs are met. So that raises the question, what are these fundamental human needs that require satisfaction? Now, there have been a number of theories, especially since the 1940s, identifying empirically what these needs are. I'm just going to mention here point to Maslow's, because it's quite a well-known one. And what he identified is a certain strata of needs, starting from basic physiological and safety needs, and they're identified more in the right-hand column there, and then progressing up to social needs, self-esteem needs, and self-actualization needs. There have been other theories, which I won't go into. The other thing I want to point to is how we find out about what these basic needs are that need satisfying for people to be happy, is these worldwide surveys on human happiness. And there's been quite a number of them in the last couple of decades. And there's some really important learnings come out of them. I'm just drawing on one document here that isolates these learnings. So the first one is that health is an important requirement for people to be at least minimally happy. Another one is that you don't suffer a disability. Another one is that people need to be gainfully employed if they're going to be minimally happy. Now, what I've done with each of these learnings is that I've matched them up with a need that's identified, a fundamental need identified by Maslow. These are in blue. And I've also tacked in here a couple of things that's spoken often about in the human rights literature in red. These are dignity and autonomy. So I've linked each one of these learnings of what we learn from empirical studies about what makes people happy and tied it up with what we know from research makes people happy. And there's a strong cross correlation here. The other key learnings are that the more money people have up to a particular point, the more money people have up to a particular point is a requirement for people to be happy. And generally, the more money you have, the happier you are up to a particular level. The other key learnings are that if people are discriminated against on the basis of race or gender, that will dramatically reduce their level of happiness. And the last key learning, which is a really important learning, is that people need to feel like they're in control of their lives. They need to be autonomous. They need to make their own choices. And that's a fundamental requirement for people to be happy. And once again, I've tied these to what's come out of Maslow. So the next thing I did was tie in these learnings from Maslow and these international surveys and link them to the particular articles in human rights documents. And I picked on this real key one, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And what I did was there's 27 articles, and I've seen whether each one of these articles points to one of these fundamental needs that need to be satisfied for people to lead happy and satisfying lives. And I matched each one of these up, and you can see that they match up, each one matches up with multiple fundamental needs that need to be satisfied. So in blue, again, what's identified by Maslow. in red, what's identified in the human rights literature as basic to human rights and basic to the satisfaction of needs. So all the 27 articles link up to multiple of these fundamental needs. So, you know, the key point here is actual human rights documents tap into these fundamental requirements for human happiness. And this is a consequentialist, I emphasize this is a consequentialist way of looking at human rights and justifying human rights. So that's through to 27 claims, 27 articles. The other key thing is that there's not just the articles in the human rights documents, there are preambles too. When you read the preambles, that also supports the consequentialist framing of these human rights. In these preambles, it points to the fundamental importance of human needs and human happiness. I'm just going to pick on one. I'm going to pick on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This is the one we've been talking about, a really preeminently important one. And looking at the preamble, it says, recognizing that in accordance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ideal of free human beings enjoying civil and political freedom, there's that autonomy thing, and freedom from fear and want, these basic human requirement to avoid suffering, can only be achieved if conditions are created whereby everyone may enjoy his civil and political rights as well as his economic, social and cultural rights. So what I'm suggesting here is that these preambles is just one example. These preambles frame the need for human rights in this need for satisfying these basic human needs, which is, I put it to you, as a consequentialist way of looking at things. So there's other examples there. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is consequentialism is the best way of adjudicating when human rights conflict between themselves and with other basic needs and duties. So, you know, a current day example is the right not to wear a face mask, which some people are claiming during this pandemic. Now, that's a liberty right, and that comes crashing against the right to health, which is a safety right, a basic human right to safety for the general population. Another one is, in the literature, right to conscientious objection to military service. Once again, a classic liberty right, and that's butting up against the right to life and security, which is a fundamental safety right, which is enshrined in all of these human rights documents. What I want to put to you tonight is that if general happiness, if considering general utility is not an arbiter in these kinds of conflicts, then we lapse into a battle between our competing personal intuitions. And I warn against just relying on competing personal intuitions, because these are subject to personal bias. So you need a rational method for doing it. And I think consequentialism does that. And what I want to suggest here, this isn't just theoretical, when you look at the actual human rights documents, and I've pointed to some of them tonight, when you look at them, that is in fact how they resolve conflicts between individual rights and the greater welfare, the general welfare of a community. And I want to give a couple of examples here. I've got 4 case studies which you can look at your leisure, but I just want to point to one or two. Here are 3 articles out of the European Convention, and each of these articles in bold is the caveat, This particular right to privacy or whatever can be overridden in this more general social interest. But more importantly than that, there's a general caveat. Now here I'm looking at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There's a general caveat for all of the rights in this particular document. And the general caveat is I'm just making sure I've got the right page. Right, I'm looking at the American Convention on Human Rights. In chapter 5, down the bottom, it says the rights of each person are limited by the rights of others, by the security of all, you know, general welfare consideration, and by the just demands of the general welfare in a democratic society. And just going back to another point in the same document, Article 4.1 says, in time of public emergency which threatens the life of the nation and the existence of which is officially proclaimed, the states parties to the present covenant may take measures derogating from their obligations. Now, that's not just this obligation or that obligation. It's all of the obligations that are specified in this international covenant. Derogating, that means that they can set them aside from their obligations under this present covenant. So what I'm saying here is this balancing, well, not balancing, it's the overriding of particular rights of particular people or groups of people can be overridden when there are these general welfare considerations in play. Okay, so I've talked about conflicts. The last thing I want to address is some objections. So you might say, sure, Les, considering consequences is important for identifying human rights and deciding between conflicting rights, but that's not the whole story. Les, you've forgotten about these things that are independent of human happiness and suffering, like autonomy, dignity, justice, and minority. So I just want to have a quick look at some of these objections and how consequentialists could respond to them. So the objection about autonomy. I want to take you back to the worldwide happiness surveys. An important finding there was that autonomy is a fundamental enabler of a happy life. And just a quote from the survey, this study, countries where people feel free to choose and control their lives tend to be countries where people are happier. The second thing is I'll point to a number of psychological theories and studies that show, again, that autonomy is a crucial requirement for human happiness. And I pointed to Maslow. There's a number of other theories. And if you look at the research on organizational behavior, the same thing comes out as well. I also appeal to your own lived experience. How did you feel in those times in your life when you had no or little control over your work, your environment, and your life? When you look back at those times and when you were in those times, did you feel happier or did you feel discontented and unhappy? So the conclusion there is that autonomy is a key enabler of human happiness. It's not separate from it. So it's well encapsulated within a consequentialist ethical framework. I'm going to skip over dignity because I think I might be running out of time. I did want to talk about justice, another important objection. Considering only consequences, the objection goes. It ignores the importance of justice and fairness. Now, I do want to say that that's a really good objection to one form of utilitarianism called act utilitarianism that only looks at the consequences of individual acts. And there are classic counterexamples to this. There's the doctor who secretly harvests the organs of one live patient to save 5 other patients' lives. And I've got 2 other classic counterexamples there. And I think these are good objections to act utilitarianism. But there's a much better, much more adequate, much more nuanced, much more sophisticated version of utilitarianism for which this kind of objection doesn't appeal to. And it's the kind that I call rules in practice utilitarianism. And with that, we don't judge the individual act, we judge the social practice or the institution in which that act is done. So if the institution or the practice is justified on the grounds of maximizing happiness, for example, our system of road rules, this is a really good example, the system of road rules, that has utilitarian justification because it stops people speeding and killing other people, and it allows for better traffic flow with red lights and green lights. So overall, it's better if we all obey the road rules. But I can't justify running through a red light for the reason that there's no one else around. Once I buy into the system of road rules and agree that that's to my benefit and to everyone's benefit, I can't then point to instances of breaking the rule when there's a small advantage in terms of overall utility. So there's a little bit more on rules in practice utilitarianism that you can look at. I'll skip the principle of impartiality. I want to go next to the last objection, minorities. The objection is considering only consequences supports the persecution of minorities in some cases. And an example that's been put to me, it's in the literature, the Roman punishment of Christians. So, you know, there's 20,000, this was in the 2nd to the 4th centuries, where in Rome and around the Roman Empire, where Christian prisoners, they were already in prison, and they were set upon in the amphitheatre by wild beasts for the pleasure of the Romans. So there's 20,000 Romans in the amphitheatre. Each of them gets a bit of pleasure from the show. And the argument is because there's 20,000, each of those little bits of happiness, of pleasure, outweighs the lot of suffering by the 1 or 2 or 5 Christians who are being mauled. So that's the objection. Now, I reckon when you do the calculations, it doesn't work out that way. It's not the case that the suffering of the Christians is outweighed by the many joyous episodes of the 20,000 Romans. So I have a methodology for comparing the joy of a Roman with the misery of a Christian. You can have a look at that. We can talk about that later. What I want to do is, this is the important bit, when you actually look at the case and when you actually do the sums, and here's a case that where I've put the figures in. So in the right-hand column is considering all of the pleasures and sufferings of the people involved, the animal breeders, the animals, the Christians, the Romans, and you sum all of their pleasures and displeasures. I want you to just look at the bottom line. What I've calculated here is the total amount of pleasure had by the Romans is 20,000 units of pleasure. That's in blue, 20,000 units of pleasure. When you count up all the sufferings, I've counted up 271,000 units of suffering by all the people who are suffering. So in this case, the total suffering outweighs the total pleasures by a factor of around 13, 14 to 1. Now, I think this is a massive underestimate. And I'll just point to 2 principles that we can talk about later, why I think it's even a massive underestimate. There's the law of diminishing marginal utility, and there's another principle, and that is the asymmetry between the maximums of suffering and of happiness. On the basis of these 2 principles and doing the actual calculations, I think this is a conclusion we can come to, that it is never the case, when you make a small group of people suffer for the benefit of a much larger group for their pleasure, it's never the case that the pleasures of the larger group outweigh the sufferings of the persecuted group. And I think that's what allows us to have confidence in these human rights principles that outlaw the persecution of minorities. I say a little bit, so that's just looking at it from an act utilitarian perspective. If you're a rule in practice utilitarian, which I advise, then there are additional protections built in to make the case even stronger. There's a utilitarian reformist tradition, which we can talk about later. So far from the utilitarianism from its classical days in the 1700s, far from excusing the persecution of minorities, utilitarians have been at the forefront of defending the rights and the welfare of minorities. And I've got a quote there from John Stuart Mill. Okay, so I hope I've achieved the 3 objectives I wanted to achieve in this short talk. One is that looking at human rights through a consequentialist, in particular a utilitarian lens, makes sense of human rights. And the second thing is that it's got the big advantage of being able to give us a method for rationally adjudicating when rights conflict. And the other thing is that I hope I've done something to address some of the objections to a consequentialist view on human rights. So thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing what Akiva has to say.
Thanks, Les. I can already see some discussions coming up in the chat part. It's going to be a very interesting Q&A session. But before we get there, without much ado, let me just introduce our next speaker, Akiva, who is no stranger here. So he's a philosopher and an IT professional. He studied philosophy and sociology at Monash, and he's completing an MA and he completed an MA in 2010 on the rights of parents and children. Akiva has researched on the moral attitudes of separated parents towards shared parenting, and he believes that our interest to pursue family relationships are among the central moral and human rights claims. His passions include reading and shows that explore moral, social, and political ideas. He enjoys discussing life purpose, ethics, religion, and philosophy, as we have witnessed in the last few months. At least I have only in the last few months. Welcome, Akiva, and let's hear what you have to say.
So much, sure, and thank you, Les, for setting up the dialogue so beautifully. I will respond to many of the substantive challenges, or I will attempt to respond to many of the substantive challenges you have put forward. I'll just grab a presentation, because that's always good, I think, for the listener to be able to follow along while I'm explaining some concepts. So that's the question which Les and I have put ourselves forward to dialogue regarding, and which the audience may well have. You may each have your own views as to whether that question should be answered in the affirmative or otherwise. So that's the challenge. Do moral consequences, I guess, implied on their own without reference to other moral claims, justify human rights? So my answer to the question immediately is going to be in two parts. The response to the positive claim is actually going to be contingent, as I will explain. So essentially, I'm going to say that moral consequences based solely on utilitarian reasoning about best outcomes in terms of happiness or well-being may justify human rights. But I will cite historical and contemporary examples to suggest that is not reliably the case always. So my positive claim will be that human rights most certainly are justified, but they are so justified by reference to a number of high priority moral claims, which actually have greater weight than aggregate outcomes. So what that's going to involve. So that's the overall claim, and I'm going to argue that human rights basically are high priority claims which correspond, is basically a key concept in human rights, that moral claims correspond to duties for others, mainly not to interfere, but also to provide certain required social goods, to protect the freedom or to provide a benefit for the rights holder. So the two conclusions I'm going to argue for, I've called them conclusion 1 and conclusion 2 there. The first is that consequences provide only contingent support for human rights. And the second positive claim will be that human rights can be justified based on a number of principles, including equal basic liberties, appeals to justice and fairness, and a number of moral intuitions and indeed common moral conventions in all societies regarding the importance of autonomy and freedom. So with that agenda in mind, I might move fairly quickly through this, because Les has very helpfully summarized a lot of this contrast for us already. So the moral theories we're going to consider, there's also virtue ethics, which are very helpfully outlined for us based on the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle just a couple of months ago. But we're going to set that one to the side. The two moral theories of interest to us right now are going to be the appeal to consequences, consequentialism, and human rights or deontological theory, as Les has already introduced. So the former looks at the notion of what is right, not to be confused with rights, but what is correct. Right conduct or wrong conduct is based on bringing out the best consequences compared to alternatives. So the sole criterion for deciding on the rightness of an action depends on the consequences. So the greatest happiness for the greatest number is the slogan of utilitarianism, a particular version of consequentialism, very prominent one, as we've discussed already, or more precisely, it seeks to maximize net utility in terms of overall human well-being and happiness. So with that in mind, it's all about the utility either of the act or of the rule, depending on whether one's subscribing to act utilitarianism or rule utilitarianism. What I wanted to point out about the latter, which potentially narrows the gap between utilitarian theory and human rights theory, is that rule utilitarians, I'll put this question a bit later, or you can to Les, accept side constraints. Once one accepts side constraints, one has the same moral claim and the same weight of potentially overriding consequences that is afforded by human rights theory. So that's utilitarianism in a small nutshell. And human rights, in contrast, looks not just at the ends, so the outcomes, which are the focus of consequentialism or utilitarianism, but also looks at the importance of very high priority or stringent moral claims, which constrain. Notice in the previous slide, I referred to side constraints, and human rights ethics is going to say there are certain super important high priority moral claims which constrain the range of permissible actions in a particular decision space. So the distinction which Les has already introduced for us is that the one focuses on telos, that being consequentialism, the aim or the purpose, basically the ends of an action, and regards those as primary, whereas human rights theory or ethics based on human rights looks at a deontological approach, which actually means pretty much what is right, what's been glossed these days to refer to duties or obligations. So the diagram there suggests that rights most definitely need to be balanced with responsibilities, and as I'll explain in a minute, the most crucial human rights, the highest priority ones, are in fact those that are correlated to the duties of others. So let me give a quick practical example. The right of a child not to be abused is only achieved by the duties incumbent on all of us to avoid circumstances or any personal participation where a child is abused. So rights and responsibilities, two sides of the same moral scale, I suppose, with that diagram in mind. Okay, we've been through some of this, so I'll go fairly quickly through it. The typical way of understanding human rights is that some of them relate to absence of interference, so-called negative rights from Isaiah Berlin. And those are often also referred to along with the positive rights for material ability to do certain things as first-generation rights, and those are the civil and political liberties. So that's where the human rights conversation in modernity, at least, pretty much started, hence first generation. Economic, social, and cultural rights are part of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they basically deal with the necessary goods, the material circumstances, again, kind of following Maslow, not just non-interference by others, but also education, healthcare, work opportunities, and so on. The positive actual material circumstances we need to lead a flourishing life. And then the third generation are regarding, recognition of different identities, cultural, national, and also equality, which is where affirmative action, protection of minority culture and language, and many other rights, including rights to breathable air and so on, good quality air, a clean environment to live in, will come into the picture. Okay. What I will do is go through now a number of different arguments which are not simply based on overall best consequences for human rights. So I will concede to the view that's just been presented that it is possible that consequences will justify the human rights, which I will argue on numerous grounds we all very much, have reason to consider of great importance. So one argument against human rights simply being based on best outcomes is that notion of best outcomes, the Romans feeding Christians to the lions, is perhaps an apt example, can be judged by those applying the metric at that particular point in time to maximize the social outcomes in that particular society. I agree with Les, they miscalculated that in some way, but that's part of the problem, is that human rights based on best outcomes can be misused. The second argument then, positive argument, is that human rights will support equal basic liberties and our moral intuitions about the equal worth of human beings, regardless of their ability and culture. I'll explain that more now. So here's really the pushback as to why I would consider human rights based on consequences as a contingent justification, and not always historically or in contemporary terms necessarily the case. So abusers of human rights throughout history have often used so-called justifications, hence the single quotes, which I use as a scare quote, based on supposedly improved or better social outcomes. History is replete with examples of those. You can imagine, and will be very familiar with many of them: racial discrimination in many nations across Europe, across the Americas, in South Africa with apartheid, slavery, eugenics, which I'll explain, which includes forced sterilization, bans on homosexual practice, and the list goes on. Racist and discriminatory policies were justified again, so to speak, by deeming some lives to be less worthwhile. At the exact point that Les was pointing out, some of the early bills of rights actually appeared, for example, in England. Slavery was already being practiced in that nation and throughout the British Empire and in the United States. And you can read some references I include if you disagree. In Australia, in the Northern Territory in particular, throughout the pre-modern period up until, in various cases, the early 1800s or even into the 20th century. A word on eugenics and how notions of less worthwhile lives basically played out. People know about the eugenics program in Nazi Germany. Just to point out, the concept originated some decades before Hitler's rise to power in the UK, before the end of the 19th century, so certainly into the 1900s. And in the US, there was a policy to forcibly sterilize, in the end, I think some 40 to 60,000 people who were considered genetically unfit and supposedly had hereditary feeble-mindedness, sexual perversion, habitual criminality, or epilepsy. And notice that it's now some decades later, that in the 1930s or even in the 1920s, when Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, he actually picked up on this paper written by two German eugenicists, which was titled "The Permission to Destroy Life Unworthy of Life." And that was then a core part of Nazi ideology, to kill disabled people in the hundreds of thousands. Jews, today is International Holocaust Commemoration Day, to the number of about 6 million. Gypsies, and in general, those deemed to be genetically inferior. So this will be a pivot for me to suggest that positive justifications of human rights, not simply based on consequences which can be abused by those in power, is crucial. The next set of practical case studies are indications of where equality is crucial, and this is the point at which I'm arguing for human rights protections are critically engage the recognition of equal liberties and worth of human beings. The dignity point, which was highlighted before, I would suggest is encapsulated in this notion of the equal liberty and the equal human value of every life. So examples here, again, there are many: disability rights, same-sex marriage, gender equality. Those living in Australia will be pretty familiar with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which was enacted in this country nationally, as the name suggests, in Australia from 2013 progressively. And the one of the more recent UN conventions is the Rights of Persons with Disabilities from 2006, which was ratified by Australia 2 years later. Marriage equality was the subject of a national postal vote in Australia, and same-sex marriage was enacted that same year by the federal parliament in, I think, December of 2017. To highlight the importance of equality, or genuine respect for the equality of human beings, regardless of gender and all the other distinctions. Family violence against women, I would suggest, demands not only protection in terms of police, but also genuine social respect for equal human rights of all rights holders, regardless of the various distinctions which we sometimes focus on between people. So here's a quote many people will know. Phil Cleary as an equality advocate. He is such because that's his conviction, but he's also such and very engaged and high profile, partly because of the murder of his sister 33 some years ago, Vicky Cleary, in 1987. This is a quote from The Age: "The trial and the jury result and the subsequent jail sentence were insults to the victim, an indictment on the system, and an official ratification that women were second-class citizens to be blamed for their brutal fate." So this relates to her murderer, Vicky Cleary's murderer, getting a sentence of some 3.5 years for murder. And supposedly the provocation defense, was enough to reduce the charge and the sentence from first-degree murder to manslaughter, which I would say is a significant violation not only of her basic right to life, but also of her equal respect as a human being, and her death being sufficiently regarded. I will run through then a number of areas where I think human rights can be justified then independent of consequences. One is the notion that, from Hume and that tradition in philosophy, and very strongly supported by empirical research, that moral intuitions, our sense of what's right and wrong, precede formal moral reasoning and application of a calculus of consequences and the rest. So here's a quote from Jonathan Haidt, saying, thanks to Ken Young and others on this call who've helped introduce me to his writing. We have strong feelings that tell us in clear and certain terms that some things simply cannot be done and that other things simply must be done. It's not obvious how to make sense of these feelings, so with the help of some especially creative philosophers, we make up rationally appealing stories about rights. So rights come along after the fact to explain what we clearly understand about right and wrong, before going to university or whatever and studying moral philosophy. That isn't Jonathan Haidt himself, it's a quote from another piece of research which he refers to. This will be part of an appeal to moral intuitions and also the notion of equal basic liberties to justify human rights. So the next part of that justification is looking at the principles of justice and fairness, which famously stem significantly in the modern period from John Rawls, the theory of justice, and basically those principles derive the basic liberties. So if we consider impartially the needs of individuals in the so-called original position where we're entering into a social contract, we'll end up with the first principle of justice, which is for each person to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. So those basic liberties are, political liberties, freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience, freedom of the person, not to be psychologically harmed or to have one's physical integrity, such as forced sterilization, undermined, right to hold property, freedom from arbitrary arrest and seizure of property, and so on. Okay, I think I will sort of borrow from the presentation we've just heard to say we all agree that there's a number of vital needs, which include security, material subsistence, basic equality, personal freedom, and recognition as members of the human community, which we can get from Maslow or many other places in our own sense of the world and in social and psychological theory. And really the argument is that those basic or vital needs and the interests of all people to live at least a minimally worthwhile life based on our own assessment of that, that entails a set of moral rights and corresponding duties on others not to cause harm. So human rights on this account will be justified by the vital needs of all human beings. And just to emphasize, where there's conflicts basically between consequences, which I suggest can exist, then these are independent justifications for human rights without needing to appeal to contested consequences. The second last of the justifications I'll run through is the sense of moral claims as high priority kind of restrictions or constraints on what is acceptable as choices, in terms of the moral decisions that are made. So Judith Jarvis Thomson, famously in The Realm of Rights, refers to American legal analyst Hofeld's distinction that there's a particular type of right which we'll focus on for now, which are rights in the strictest sense, which are claims against the interference from others with your life, your liberty, or your property. And the famous case, which Les already alluded to, is called transplant. If the surgeon cuts the young man up, removes his parts and transplants them into his 5 patients, the young man will die, but the 5 will live. If the surgeon does not do that, the young man will live, but the 5 will die. So that scenario is a clear no-go, side constraint, strict rights claim, which cannot be violated, even though the consequences appear better. And the rules consequentialist, I fully understand, will agree with that. But the rights theorist has a very clear reasoning for those rights, which are maximally stringent, not being able to be traded off, at least in most cases. Many of you will be familiar with Charlie. We'll talk about that in a minute. That's another thought experiment. But in this case, the stringency of the right is very clear. Therefore, the high priority moral claims based on the value of life and liberty or autonomy allow us to make our choices as human beings, and that justifies human rights on those grounds. The last justification I'll offer just briefly is looking at universal standards. This is also referred to by Walzer and Nussbaum as a kind of universal thin ethic, or kind of a shared moral conception between all cultures and nations. And basically, these moral standards will protect basic liberties, the vital needs, and core moral claims of all. So this is an appeal. You'll notice the basic liberties, vital needs, and core moral claims have been mentioned before as independent justifications, but this is sort of wrapping them up and saying that these are universal standards and therefore perfectly defensible as common universal moral principles, which are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and many other rights conventions. Just to explain the notion of trade-off and to concede that consequences do make a difference and are part of the moral landscape, in my view, but are not primary or the priority within it. So human rights limit morally acceptable trade-offs of utility. And the trolley example, an out-of-control trolley is hurtling down a track. Straight ahead on the track are 5 men who will be killed if the trolley reaches them. Bloggers can throw a switch and turn the trolley onto the spur of track on the right. There's 1 man on that spur of track on the right. That man will be killed if Bloggers turns the trolley. So the 5 men who will be killed, they have a highly stringent, a very strict rights to their lives, as does the 1 man who will be killed if Blogs takes the action. What Thompson explains by way of response to why is this different to transplant, she explains that the circumstances, the features of the scenario are significantly different, that there is no alternative here, either 1 person will die or 5 will die, and that the specific features of if you were a worker on the track and you didn't know what your position would be, would you accept that Blogs should throw the switch? The answer usually comes back as yes. So as a committed human rights theorist, I'm still happy with throwing the switch to save 1 life and save 5 lives, and I accept there is moral residue in that 1 person will be killed by the action, because 5 people would be killed by the inaction. So that's the appeal basically to clear global and national moral standards, and basically the rights due to all of us for respectful treatment as human beings in all circumstances. This is the quick summary of the realm of morality, if you like. Universal morality, on my account, has central to its foundations the realm of rights, which we've been through from Thompson and others, and rules. There are claims, privileges, powers, and immunities. I haven't had time to speak through the non-claims rights. There's slightly lower priority rights. There's first, second, and third generation rights. There's negative rights, which are freedoms. Positive rights, the ability to do things. Consequences undoubtedly are part of the moral landscape, but in my view, play a slightly secondary or supportive role to rights, which are constraints on permissible action. And we have certain trade-offs which are acceptable, but rights limit which ones are indeed morally acceptable. That's the 6 claims. One is a sort of negative or partial justification, in my view. So human rights may be justified, or they may indeed, historically, we've seen and in contemporary circumstances, be abused by appealing to best outcomes. And the others I won't run through again are basically a series of 5 justifications for human rights on consequentially independent grounds, so on grounds which are largely independent of consequences.
Thank you both, Les and Akiva, for this. I've been observing the chat and the different kinds of comments and observations coming up over there, and I'm sure that will lead into a very, very good discussion. I can already see some of the possible strings of questions and bones of discontent over there, but all in the game. Opening it up both to, opening up the thing to just Akiva and Les for now. Your dialogue, please.
I've got 3 things that I wanted to ask Akiva about, and there's many more, but these are the 3 key ones. So I'll start with one of them. Thompson and the trolley switching the switch to kill 1 person to save 5 people on the track. Akiva, you agree with the consequentialists that the right thing here is to move the switch to save the 5. But I'm really intrigued here because the person who was killed, if he knew he was going to be killed, he would say, hey, Mr. Switchman, you are abrogating, you are ignoring my fundamental right to life. And it's your action, your positive action in particular, that is going to kill me. And then the switchman says, oh yeah, I recognize all of that, but there's worse consequences if I don't do that. And what I'm thinking is, with all of these human rights declarations and covenants, which are all good, which I agree with, I'm surprised that you think that they can be all of that, and all of them have a right to life as a fundamental right in their articles. I'm surprised, Kiva, that you're so willing to give that up so readily to save 5 lives against 1, and apparently on consequentialist grounds. So you're so willing to give up this fundamental right to a life on a consequentialist ground. To me, that seems to me you're a bit wishy-washy on the human rights thing, especially with this fundamental human right to life.
So, thank you, Les. My response is that there are very particular features of this situation that after probably some months, the first time I encountered Trolley, and after many years now of reflection on it, lead me to a clear conviction that in those particular circumstances, given the feature of that case, there are trade-offs possible, and that, you know, an entire chapter of The Realm of Rights is what Judith Jarlath Thompson argues. So without appealing to authority and say, well, she argues, therefore I agree with her, the substance of the reasoning is that if individuals consider those very particular circumstances and imagine themselves, I will draw an analogy to rules and a contract. There it's a contract for the whole of society in the original position. But in this particular circumstance, if we imagined ourselves as workers in a perilous circumstance, let's say we replace the trolley with, you know, being down a mine, and there is a way of taking action which will save the life of 5 miners buried deep beneath the earth, and the consequence of our action, some, you know, underground drilling activity, is that it will kill 1. I would say that the rescue personnel would, in good conscience, make that decision. It doesn't abrogate the importance of the right to life in almost all circumstances. These are very particular circumstances with, you know, unusual features. Transplant is very different. Would you agree, Les, that transplant is substantially different? I'll return the challenge to you. And that transplant is a clear case where side constraints, as you may refer to them, or rights, rule as entirely impermissible the taking of the young person's life to save the life of 5 others.
Oh, sure. In the medical case, that there's a whole medical institution and medical ethics around the care of doctors for their patients. So there's a whole institution around that bars the chopping up of 1 person to take the organs out to save 5. And I agree, it's quite different because there's no institutions around the pushing of the switch of an individual. But when you say that the person who pushes the switch to save the 5 lives, he could draw upon an ideal social contract where the social contractarians agree that in that situation, we all agree the best thing is to push the switch because I might be one of the 5 that will be saved. So the impartial reasoning goes. But that really strikes me that those people who are thinking of in terms of this, those people who are agreeing to that contract, they're not thinking in terms of fundamental human rights. They are thinking in consequentialist utilitarian terms when they agree to that contract. So I think that's doing a disservice to your case, that kind of answer, appealing to that kind of ideal contract. But I want to move. If you want to talk more about this, I've got two other really substantive things I wanted to ask you about. But each of these, I mean, this really illustrates each of these issues is a whole conversation in itself, and there's a lot of things to tease apart here. Can I come to the second thing I wanted to ask you about? Look, I'm torn between. You seem to have two reliances. One is you're relying on the we got to rely on intuitions, and you sound a bit like they're Bernard Williams there. You know, let's do away with moral theory, and we've got to recognise our fundamental intuitions, and that's what informs our system of human rights. So, on the one hand, you want to rely on intuitions, naked intuitions. But on the other hand, you're relying on Rawls and the social contract theory. And with Rawls, it's the opposite, because that's a real Kantian reliance on pure reason. And with Rawls, the way he sets up the original position is that people behind the veil of ignorance, acting purely on their self-interest, and when they apply perfect reason, what two principles, he comes out with two principles, what two principles will they come up with? So I see two quite radically different approaches, and I'm not sure which one you're really serious about and which one you're willing to ditch. Well, they're conflicting to my mind.
No, I don't think they're conflicting. I can turn this into a question back at you, which I'll do in a minute, which is the role of side constraints. So essentially, once one moves from being an act consequentialist to being a rule consequentialist, as you evidently are, you accept the role of side constraints. So essentially, your moral universe, I would suggest, consists, as I diagrammed it, of some appeal to side constraints. You just choose not to label them rights, and I guess I'd like to inquire why that is, because the side constraint or the rule is essentially the equivalent of the human rights, which all of the conventions include. So that's the question, but before I let you answer it, the balance between social contract is that, in fact, social contract also includes an appeal to intuitions, a sense of justice and a sense of fairness, and reason is not in this context opposed to what those intuitions offer. So intuitions, as I mentioned, from Walzer and Nussbaum, also are a description of what is shared universal morality. So that's empirical research. That's what the majority of societies, save for those who we'd all recognize as, despots and murderous dictators, can readily agree to. So the common conception both of individuals' intuitions and of societies broadly share everything with Kantian and Rawlsian appeal to reason as what the universal law would define. And my only retreat from the Kantian notion is that the rules do not need to be absolute. So what I've learned from ethical theory and from history is that consequentialism and utilitarianism from John Stuart Mill and others has what to offer, but so does the notion of very clear side constraints. Therefore, those two which you're suggesting are inconsistent are in fact used in concert to strengthen the arguments and to allow nuance in the response to when human rights may in fact be overridden, and how you arbitrate between different human rights. So the question to you then, Les, if I may, is why in this dialogue you see any significant distinction between human rights as I've advocated for them with a broad set of moral justifications, why you distinguish between that and what is necessarily a side constraint in rules and practice utilitarianism. Are they really that different? Are you essentially supporting the human rights justifications on consequentially independent grounds.
Right. I don't think I'm fully understanding your question, Akiva. Certainly, within my rules in practice utilitarianism, there are constraints on behaviour that come from the institutions that we agree operate in our lives, the justice institution, the education institution, the medical institution, the road laws institution that I was talking about before. We all agree to the institution of road laws because it's all to our benefit. And there we say that I don't have a right to go through a red light when it's to my advantage, when nobody else is around, because I buy into the institution of of road rules. So if you could rephrase the question, Akiva, I'm not sure.
No, that's fair enough, Les. I guess my question is, are side constraints which you'll accept or rules simply human rights in another name? So does the distinction between your view and mine become one of the conceptual label as opposed to the substance of the concept?
Well, I see different layers of rights. So, for example, with the road rules, we say, I have a right to travel up to 100 kilometres an hour on the open road. That's a right, but that's a legal right. So I recognise the system of legal rights. It comes from the institutions. But there's also a system of moral rights. So if that it's not governed by legal government institutions, like if you promise to meet me at 5 o'clock, I have a moral right to expect you to keep that promise. But that's embedded within a social right. So that comes under rules in practice utilitarianism as well, because we all buy into the system, the practice of promise making and promise keeping, because it's to all of our benefit. And that bars me from making act utilitarian excuses when it's to my advantage or someone else's advantage. So there I have a moral right. So there's legal rights, there's moral rights, and then on top of all of that, at the highest level, are what we call human rights. And the human rights are rights not in virtue, not only in virtue, not only in virtue of the particular government or institutions we are under. Our human rights derive from our nature as human beings. And as human beings, we have certain fundamental needs for life, for shelter, for autonomy. So the human rights sit above all of that, and they can be enshrined in legal rights as they are. So I see three systems of rights: the lower legal rights, the moral rights, and then the moral human rights at the top. So I buy into all of the rights talk. As a consequentialist, not only do I buy into the rights talk at all three levels, but for me, consequentialism makes the most sense of where those rights come from and how they have normative force. And B, as I said in my talk, gives us a rational way of adjudicating between conflicting rights that are not based on personal intuitions. That's one of my fundamental worries. If you're only relying on personal intuitions, you get into a lot of trouble, and we've done that historically, because you talk about the persecution of homosexuals, the keeping of slaves, the enslavement of women. All of those were based on deontological rules, either from God or from an institution that thought that society would it's different in different cases. Say, take homosexuality. That was really in Haidt's term, a repugnancy reaction. And then, so that was the intuition, and the intuition has a genetic evolutionary basis, being repugnant about homosexual acts. And that's why it was thought wrong and was brought over into the moral sphere. And I must say, it was the utilitarians traditionally who pushed back against the repression of homosexuals by arguing specifically that laws against homosexuals caused an enormous amount of harm to people who deserved respect. It was the utilitarian thinking that got rid of repressive homosexual laws. The human rights bit came later.
With the permission or as a suggestion to Les and to our moderator, may I reply to that? And then perhaps we do want to open, I'm sure everybody else is burning to enter into this dialogue and ask their questions. So by way of reply to your points, it will depend on one's particular reading of history as to, let's say, homosexuality, slavery, as to whether the divine command, I see some comments about that in the chat, was the central immoral foundation, but the appeal to a rule or to a higher order, understanding of, divine purpose for white people, let's say, compared to people of other colors. But on homosexuality as an example, I can push back and say very famous, paper and presentation from the late 1950s in the UK. Lord Devlin, Patrick Devlin, a law lord, was arguing for the enforcement of public morals. He apparently hadn't read or ignored what John Stuart Mill said. If they are, self-regarding acts between same-sex couples, they would have no impact, because he was concerned about protecting the social good. To just expand briefly on the eugenics argument, that was an express appeal to the pseudoscience, completely misunderstood notions of human worth. But they, the US in the examples that I cited, were looking at forced sterilization, and they, being Nazi Germany, looked at that again. The quotes I should probably have brought, which were essentially, this is for the social good. So those are the incorrect appeals, I agree. An ideal, impartial, utilitarian arbiter, an ideal observer, as Rawls refers to it, may come up with the same justifications as all the other ways of defending human rights. But I suggest again that it's contingent. So much more to discuss.
And hopefully we will get a chance to talk about the Nazi eugenics program, because I have some things to say about that, because that was formed part of the last part of your talk. So hopefully we won't end tonight without some commentary on that.
Sure.
So over to you, Usha.
Thanks both Les and Akiva. I can see a lot of questions coming up in the chat box over there, a lot of useful discussions starting already.
To access other videos and podcasts in this series, go to the Philosophy Resources section of the Rational Realm website at www.rationalrealm.com.